billionaire installed camera to monitor his disabled twins. What he saw the black maid do shocked him. Richard Blackstone almost dropped his $3,000 whiskey when he saw the scene on his office monitor. His hands trembled as he held his cell phone, watching through the security app what was happening in the children's room that Tuesday morning. There were his 3-year-old twins, Daniel and David, both diagnosed with severe cerebral palsy. And there was Keisha Washington, the 28-year-old caregiver he had hired just 2 weeks earlier, against all the advice of his Manhattan social elite. But what he saw on the screen defied everything the most expensive doctors in New York had said about his sons. The boys were moving. Really moving. Not the involuntary spasms Richard knew so well, but coordinated, intentional movements. Daniel was holding a toy firmly. David was moving his head to the sound of Keisha's voice, who was singing softly while massaging his little legs with a technique Richard had never seen before. 2 weeks ago, when the elite agency suggested Keisha, Richard almost hung up on the coordinator. "You're offering me a girl from the Bronx to take care of my children? I pay $200,000 a year for the best professionals, not social experiments." But the 11th caregiver had just been fired for negligence, another failure in the endless list of specialists who promised miracles and delivered only depressing medical reports. Richard was desperate, though he would never admit it publicly. Keisha had arrived that Monday morning carrying a small cloth bag and a smile that immediately irritated Richard. He expected nervousness, submission, the obvious recognition of the class difference between them. Instead, she greeted the boys as if they were normal children, completely ignoring the wheelchairs and medical equipment. "Hi, beautiful boys. I'm Keisha. We're going to have so much fun together," she had said, kneeling down to their eye level, her voice filled with a genuine joy that Richard hadn't heard in that house in years. Richard had installed cameras in every corner of the mansion after the 5th caregiver stole prescription drugs. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford when it came to his children. But now, watching Keisha work through the security lenses, he felt something he didn't recognize, hope mixed with deep unease. The young woman from the Bronx was doing something that none of the expensive Harvard specialists had been able to do. And if what he saw on the monitor was real, everything Richard believed about limitations, possibilities, and especially who deserved his trust was about to be completely destroyed. Meanwhile, in the boys' room, Keisha whispered something that the cameras couldn't quite pick up, but it made Daniel smile for the first time in months. A real, conscious smile, directed specifically at her. Richard realized that his breathing had quickened. What the hell was going on in his own home? And why did this woman, whom he had judged by zip codes and last names, seem to know his children better than he did? If you're wondering how simple prejudice can blind someone to a miracle happening right under their nose, don't miss what comes next. This story will show you that sometimes the greatest lessons come from where we least expect them. Subscribe to the channel to find out how a complete underestimation turned into the most unexpected twist in a man's life. Richard couldn't get those images out of his head. Throughout the Blackstone Industries board meeting that morning, his mind kept returning to the monitor, to the impossible movements he had witnessed. But the more he thought about it, the more his business rationality took over. "Are you all right, Mr. Blackstone?" asked Margaret Walsh, his executive assistant of 15 years, noticing his distraction during the quarterly presentation. "Perfectly," he replied curtly, forcing himself to focus on the numbers on the screen. But the truth was that Richard felt completely out of control, a feeling he hated above all else. That afternoon, he called Dr. Harrison Mitchell, New York's most renowned pediatric neurologist, the one who had delivered the devastating diagnosis about the twins. "Richard, we've discussed this countless times," Dr. Mitchell said with the condescending patience typical of expensive doctors. "Severe cerebral palsy is not something that simply improves with alternative techniques. Any movement you're observing is involuntary spasms or primitive reflexes. But what if there's a possibility of progress that you haven't considered?" An irritating laugh echoed from the other end of the line. "Richard, you're paying a fortune for the best specialists in the country. Don't let unfounded hopes created by a caregiver make you question decades of medical knowledge." The way Dr. Mitchell pronounced caregiver, as if it were a dirty word, made something unpleasant stir in Richard's stomach. But he pushed the feeling away and agreed with the doctor. Meanwhile, 3 floors below in his mansion, Keisha worked with Daniel and David, completely oblivious to the doubts that hung over her work. She had arrived that morning carrying a simple plastic folder, the kind that costs $2 at neighborhood stationery stores. What Richard didn't know was that inside that unassuming folder were copies of scientific articles on childhood neuroplasticity, printed on cheap paper but meticulously highlighted with a yellow pen. Keisha Washington was not just a girl from the Bronx as he had imagined. She had graduated from the State University of New York with a degree in physical therapy, specializing in child neurological development. For 4 years, she had worked at Harlem Children's Hospital, where she treated children whose families couldn't afford the Dr. Mitchells of the world. There she had learned that miracles happen when you combine science with unconditional love, something that Manhattan offices seem to have forgotten. But Keisha knew that mentioning her credentials in that environment would be counterproductive. Men like Richard Blackstone only listened to degrees when they came framed in mahogany offices, not when they were carried in plastic folders by black women from the Bronx. Around 3 in the afternoon, Richard decided to do a surprise inspection of the children's room. He found Keisha on the floor, gently moving David's legs in specific patterns while humming a nursery rhyme. "What exactly are you doing?" His voice cut through the air like a cold blade. Keisha didn't flinch. Neurosensory stimulation based on repetitive movement patterns. It helps the brain form new connections. "And where did you learn that? In what course?" The question was loaded with disdain. Richard expected stammering excuses, perhaps an admission that she was just trying to help with no real scientific basis. "In Dr. Robert Chen's neuroplasticity classes at NYU, Keisha replied calmly, continuing the exercise. He has published extensive studies on how the brains of children with cerebral palsy can develop alternative pathways when properly stimulated in the early years of life. Richard blinked, taken aback. He knew Dr. Chun. He had tried to consult him months ago, but the specialist's schedule was booked solid for 2 years. "Are you telling me you know Dr. Chen?" "I was his mentee during my residency at Harlem Children's Hospital," Keisha said, finally looking at Richard. "I've treated hundreds of cases similar to your son's. The difference is that there, we don't give up on the first diagnosis." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Richard felt the floor moving beneath his feet. This woman, whom he had judged by zip codes and accents, had credentials he didn't even know existed. But pride is powerful armor. Instead of admitting his prejudice, Richard doubled down. "If you're so qualified, why are you working as a home caregiver?" The question came out crueler than he intended, but Keisha just smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Because sometimes, Mr. Blackstone, the people most in need aren't the ones who can afford $500 consultations. And sometimes," she paused, turning her attention to Daniel, "it's the parents who most need to learn about their own children's abilities." Richard left the room with his cheeks burning with anger and something he refused to identify as shame. In the hallway, he called the caregiver agency. "I want Keisha Washington's complete file. Everything. References, academic history, professional experience. Now." As he waited for the documents to arrive by email, Richard couldn't stop thinking about the absolute confidence in Keisha's voice, the way she talked about his children as if they had a future, as if they were capable of more than all the experts in Manhattan had said. And for the first time in 3 years, Richard Blackstone, who had built an empire based on never underestimating his opponents, realized that he might have completely underestimated the woman who cared for his children. What that arrogant billionaire had no idea was that every condescending question, every look of disdain, only strengthened the determination of a woman who had dedicated her entire life to proving that impossible is just a misinformed opinion of those who gave up fighting too soon. The email arrived at 7 the next morning. Richard opened Keisha Washington's file while drinking his imported coffee, ready to confirm his suspicions about exaggerations in the caregiver's resume. 15 minutes later, he pushed the cup away, the coffee cold and forgotten. Graduated magna cum laude from NYU. Residency at Harlem Children's Hospital. 3 articles published in scientific journals on childhood neuroplasticity. 2 awards for innovation in alternative therapies. And the reference that made Richard almost choke, Dr. Robert Chun had personally written that Keisha Washington represents the future of pediatric neurological physical therapy. Dr. Chun, the same specialist Richard had tried unsuccessfully to hire for 2 years. Pride is a fierce beast when wounded. Instead of admitting his mistake, Richard doubled down on his own arrogance. If Keisha was so qualified, why hadn't she mentioned any of this? She was obviously hiding something. No one with those credentials would work as a home caregiver for $15 an hour unless they had been fired for misconduct. Richard called Dr. Mitchell again. "I need you to examine my children today." I want a second opinion on this progress the caregiver is claiming. Richard, we just did a complete evaluation last month. Just come. His voice cut off any discussion. Meanwhile, in the boys' room, Keisha worked with Daniel, moving his little arms in swimming patterns while singing softly. She had noticed subtle changes that no medical equipment could capture, the way he held his breath before trying to move, as if concentrating. The way David now turned his head to follow her voice as she moved around the room. But Keisha also noticed Richard's increasingly hostile glances, the tension that hung in the house like a storm cloud. She knew this pattern. Wealthy families who hired black specialists only when desperate, but who felt threatened when competence exceeded their limited expectations. So 3 weeks ago, she had called her former supervisor at Harlem Children's Hospital. Dr. Patricia Williams? It's Keisha. I need to document a special case. Dr. Williams, a pediatric neurologist and Keisha's mentor since college, didn't hesitate. Send me everything you have. Videos, reports, progress notes. If these boys are responding as you describe, we need to officially record it. Keisha had begun discreetly filming the twins' exercises using her cell phone. Short 30-second videos showed Daniel holding objects he had previously dropped, David moving his legs intentionally, and both responding to simple commands in a coordinated manner. More importantly, she had asked Dr. Williams to review the original diagnoses. Keisha, those reports are from 3 years ago, Dr. Williams said during a call the week before. Based on neurological exams done when the children were a few months old. Neuroplasticity at that age. It's like trying to predict the ocean by observing a drop of water. They were diagnosed with severe, permanent cerebral palsy. By doctors who probably never followed the progress of intensive neural stimulation therapies. Keisha, you've seen miracles like this before. The difference is that this time you're working with infinite resources, or you should be. Dr. Williams was right. At Harlem Children's Hospital, Keisha had witnessed children with similar diagnoses achieve milestones that initial medical reports considered impossible. But there, she worked as part of a team, with institutional support, with families who celebrated every small step forward as a victory achieved together. Here in the Manhattan mansion, she fought alone against the skepticism of a man who preferred predictable tragedy to transformative possibility. On Thursday afternoon, Dr. Mitchell arrived with his characteristic arrogance and a case of diagnostic equipment that cost more than Keisha's annual salary. Richard watched on the monitors as the doctor examined the boys, waiting for confirmation that this woman was creating false hope. What he saw was Dr. Mitchell frowning, redoing tests, muttering to himself. Interesting, that wasn't in the previous report. Richard rushed down to the boys' room. So? Confirmed that there's no real progress. Dr. Mitchell took off his glasses and wiped them nervously. Richard, I have to be honest. There are changes in muscle tone, improved motor coordination, neurological responses that weren't present in previous exams. What does that mean? It means that maybe we were premature in our initial assessment. Young children, especially in cases of cerebral palsy, can exhibit exceptional neural plasticity with proper stimulation. Richard looked at Keisha, who remained silent in the corner of the room, holding one of the therapeutic toys she had brought from home. Are you telling me that an under-resourced caregiver achieved what your million-dollar treatments failed to do? Dr. Mitchell hesitated. I'm saying that different approaches can produce different results. Perhaps we should consider integrating Mrs. Washington's methods into the official protocols. Get out. Richard's voice was low, dangerous. Richard. Get out of my house. Dr. Mitchell quickly packed up his equipment and left the mansion without another word. Richard remained in the boys' room, staring at Keisha. You made me look like an idiot in front of the doctor. Keisha lifted her chin. Mr. Blackstone, I did my job. Nothing more. Your job is to follow my instructions. Not to reinvent medicine. My job is to take care of your children to the best of my ability. And that's what I'm doing. Richard felt his blood boil. There she was in his own home, challenging his authority, causing renowned doctors to question diagnoses he had accepted as absolute truth. Your contract is being reviewed. Perhaps it's time we found someone more suitable. For the first time, Keisha smiled. A smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Blackstone, before you make that decision, you may want to know that I have documented all of your children's progress. Day by day, exercise by exercise. And I have shared this data with specialists who really understand the subject. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. You did what? Dr. Patricia Williams, head of pediatric neurology at Harlem Children's, is reviewing the case. Dr. Chun has been consulted. We have 3 independent medical opinions confirming that Daniel and David are reaching developmental milestones considered impossible by the original diagnoses. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. And Mr. Blackstone? Keisha picked up her purse and walked toward the door. If you fire me now, you'll have to explain to these experts, and possibly others interested in the welfare of children with special needs, why you interrupted treatment that was working. She paused at the door and looked back one last time. Your children aren't just medical statistics. They're little miracles waiting to happen. The only question is, will you be the person who allows those miracles to happen, or the one who prevents them? Richard was left alone in the room with Daniel and David, who watched him with their big, attentive eyes. For the first time in 3 years, he really looked at them. Not as victims of a medical condition. Not as reminders of everything he had lost. But as his children. His boys. Who maybe, just maybe, were capable of much more than any diagnosis had predicted. And in that moment, Richard Blackstone realized he wasn't just fighting a caregiver who challenged his authority. He was fighting against the terrifying possibility that everything he had based his pain, his resignation, his identity as the father of special children on could be fundamentally wrong. Meanwhile, Keisha walked down the marble hallway toward the exit, knowing she had planted seeds that would soon blossom in ways even the most arrogant billionaire in Manhattan could not control. The following Friday, Richard called a meeting in his mansion office. Not just with Keisha, but with Margaret Walsh, 2 representatives from the nanny agency, and Dr. Mitchell, whom he had called back after a tense phone conversation. Miss Washington, Richard began, sitting behind his imposing desk while the others remained standing. After careful consideration, we have decided that your unorthodox methods pose a risk to my children. Keisha remained calm, holding a simple folder in her hands. You were hired to follow established medical protocols, not to play scientist with vulnerable children, Richard continued, his voice taking on a familiar arrogance. Dr. Mitchell has confirmed that any apparent progress is involuntary spasms misinterpreted as inexperienced enthusiasm. Dr. Mitchell cleared his throat nervously. Well, I did say we needed to be cautious. Cautious of false hopes created by someone without the proper qualifications, Richard cut in, looking directly at Keisha. Someone who clearly doesn't understand her place in this house. The silence hung in the air like molten lead. Keisha opened her briefcase and took out a tablet. Mr. Blackstone, before we continue, I'd like to show you something that arrived this morning. I'm not interested in your... It's a video conference with Dr. Robert Chun, head of pediatric neurology at NYU, Keisha interrupted gently, turning on the device. The screen showed Dr. Chun in his office, surrounded by diplomas and certifications that made Dr. Mitchell gulp. Mr. Blackstone, Dr. Chun said through the screen, I had the privilege of reviewing the videos and reports Dr. Washington sent me about your sons. Richard froze. Dr. Washington? Yes, Keisha Washington, my former mentee and one of the most talented neurological physical therapists I have ever trained. The documented progress in Daniel and David is extraordinary. Based on the data she has collected, I formally request permission to include this case in our upcoming publication on childhood neuroplasticity. The color drained from Richard's face. Dr. Mitchell looked like he wanted to disappear into his suit. Dr. Chun continued, the methods Dr. Washington is applying are based on cutting-edge research we published in the New England Journal of Medicine last year. Frankly, your sons are lucky to have someone with this expertise caring for them. Keisha turned the tablet to show the second screen. This is Dr. Patricia Williams, Chief of Pediatric Neurology at Harlem Children's Hospital. Dr. Williams appeared on the screen with a professional smile. Mr. Blackstone, I have reviewed your son's original diagnoses. Based on exams from 3 years ago, they are outdated and frankly limited. The progress documented by Dr. Washington suggests that Daniel and David may achieve developmental milestones significantly beyond the initial predictions. Richard felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Dr. Washington. Keisha completed her doctorate in neurological physical therapy with us 2 years ago, Dr. Williams explained. She chose to work with individual families rather than pursue an academic career. An admirable decision, considering she could be running her own department at any hospital in the country. Margaret Walsh looked at Richard, then at Keisha, her eyes wide with revelation. Keisha touched the screen again. A third connection opened, showing a black man in an impeccable suit in an elegant office. "This is Dr. James Thompson, director of the National Institute of Child Health," Keisha said calmly. He heard about the case from colleagues. Dr. Thompson bowed his head. "Mr. Blackstone, the work Dr. Washington is doing with your children represents the cutting edge of neuroplasticity therapy. We are interested in officially documenting this case for our national protocols." Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "There's one more person who would like to speak with you," Keisha said, tapping the screen one last time. The image changed to show an elegant woman in an office overlooking Manhattan. "Mr. Blackstone, I'm attorney Carol Peterson from Peterson & Associates. I represent families in medical malpractice and discrimination cases. Dr. Washington approached me with ethical concerns about how this case was being handled." Richard's blood ran cold. "Based on the reports we've reviewed, there appears to be a pattern of negligence in seeking appropriate treatment for children with special needs, possibly influenced by unconscious biases regarding the qualifications of the professional responsible for their care." Richard finally found his voice, but it came out as a hoarse whisper. "Are you threatening me?" "No, Mr. Blackstone," Keisha replied, turning off the tablet and calmly putting it away in her briefcase. "We are offering you the opportunity to do the right thing." Dr. Mitchell tried to hide behind Margaret Walsh. "For 3 weeks," Keisha continued, "I documented not only Daniel and David's progress, but also repeated attempts to interrupt treatments that were working. Attempts based not on medical evidence, but on prejudices about my professional competence." She took a second, much thicker folder out of her bag. "Here are copies of all interactions, footage of the children's progress, opinions from 5 independent experts confirming the effectiveness of the treatments, and complete documentation of how personal biases nearly prevented 2 children from receiving adequate care." Richard looked at Margaret Walsh, who avoided eye contact. He looked at Dr. Mitchell, who was studying his own shoe intently. "What do you want?" he whispered. "We want Daniel and David to receive the care they deserve," Keisha said firmly. "We want their progress to continue to be officially documented. And we want other parents in similar situations to have access to the same information and treatments." She paused, looking directly into Richard's eyes. "And we want you to understand that professional competence, Mr. Blackstone, has no skin color, zip code, or last name. It has knowledge, dedication, and love for the children we care for." Silence filled the office like water in a sinking ship. Richard Blackstone, a man who had built an empire by quickly judging people and situations, realized he had made the most basic and devastating mistake of his life. He had confused prejudice with intuition, arrogance with protection, and had almost destroyed his own children's chances by failing to see beyond his personal limitations. For the first time in decades, Manhattan's most feared billionaire had absolutely nothing to say. And the woman he had tried to humiliate stood before him, not as an employee begging for a job, but as the exceptional professional she had always been, holding in her hands the future of his children and the complete destruction of every prejudice he had used to build his identity. But what Richard didn't realize was that the real transformation was just beginning. Because when a man discovers that he has spent his entire life being his own obstacle to the miracles he sought, the journey back to humanity can be more difficult than any empire he has ever built. 6 months later, Richard watched from his office window as Daniel and David played in the garden. Not in wheelchairs, but running, yes running, after a colorful ball that Keisha had brought. The transformation had been officially documented. The twins were now participating in a national study on childhood neuroplasticity, led by Dr. Keisha Washington herself, who had accepted the offer to head Manhattan's first center of excellence in pediatric neurological therapy. The center operated out of Richard's own mansion, which he had converted an entire wing of into clinics and laboratories. 23 families had already been treated, and the results exceeded all expectations of traditional protocols. "Mr. Blackstone," said Margaret Walsh, entering the office, "2 more requests for interviews about the program have come in. CNN and NBC want to document Dr. Washington's work." Richard nodded. In recent weeks, the story had spread across the country. Not as a scandal, but as a beacon of hope. Parents of children with special needs traveled from distant states, seeking the revolutionary methods Keisha had developed. Dr. Mitchell had quietly resigned after other patients questioned his diagnoses. His clinic now referred complex cases directly to Keisha's center. "Daddy!" Daniel shouted from the garden, waving enthusiastically. "Look how fast I can run." Richard ran down the steps and hugged both boys, something he hadn't done in years. "You guys are amazing," he whispered, tears in his eyes. Keisha approached, smiling. "They've always been amazing, Mr. Blackstone. We just needed to believe." "Dr. Washington," Richard said, using her title for the first time. "How can I thank you? Continue to support other parents who are going through what you went through. And remember, competence has no color, gender, or zip code. It has knowledge, dedication, and love." Richard looked at his children running free in the garden that had once been just empty decoration. The man who had built an empire judging people by appearances discovered that he had almost missed the greatest miracle of his life because he couldn't see beyond his own prejudices. 6 months ago, he was an arrogant billionaire controlling everything through cameras. Today, he was a father learning that true miracles happen when we abandon our prejudices and embrace possibility. The lesson was clear. Sometimes, the most extraordinary people come to us disguised as exactly what we judge to be ordinary. And when that happens, we have two choices: let prejudice blind us to the miracle, or open our hearts to be transformed by unexpected greatness. Richard chose transformation. And his children, running free in that garden, were living proof that it is never too late to rewrite our own story. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more narratives that show how love and respect can create the most unexpected miracles. Because sometimes, the greatest revolution begins simply by recognizing the extraordinary humanity in the people we underestimate.